can make plans and that we can try to figure things out. And Lord, we just sometimes are at our own limits in our fallenness. And so, Lord, I'm grateful for you. And I'm grateful for our church and our members in this gathering tonight. But I pray that you would speak through Michael as we look to your word, and God, that you would give us guidance and hope. It's in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Okay, so I know we're all feeling lonely and isolated, so I thought that we would start with a little bit of discussion. So I'm going to give you like 1 minute to talk to the people around you if there are people around you, or you can type into the chat feature if there are not people around you. And I'm sending the question to you now in the chat, but here it is. Just talk to the people around you or directly in the chat about how this whole COVID-19 thing is making you feel. Like, what are the feeling words? Like, what's the feeling temperature in your heart or head today as you live through day whatever it is of the coronavirus? So there's the question in the chat. Talk to the person around you, or if you're by yourself, type the message, type your feelings directly in the chat if you're willing. Just take 1 minute. Go. So again, for those who are just showing up, talk to the person next to you or share on the chat. What are some of the feeling words that you're feeling right now during the COVID-19 pandemic? Okay, so thanks everybody for sharing how you're feeling about COVID-19 and being isolated in this pandemic. And we're going to try to be doing these Bible studies on Wednesday nights going forward. And as I was thinking about how to prepare for this first one, it was confusing because I realized like there's a lot of ways that you might be feeling. COVID-19 could make you feel all kind of ways. And the good news is the Bible gives us resources no matter what you're feeling. So some of you might be feeling like really, really on fire, anxious, and need to be hearing Paul's words about not being anxious. Or some of you might be having all of your idols sort of shoved in your face, and you need the word that Richard gave us so powerfully on Sunday from Isaiah 2, that God is greater than our idols. Some of you might be like legit angry or terrified, and you need all those psalms of lament, that give us words to speak to God where we're saying, how long, O Lord? What's the game plan here? What's going on? And those would be passages for us to go to. And we may go to some of those different passages in the weeks ahead. But there's another way that you might be feeling that I think is pretty close to the way that I'm feeling. And the technical term for it is just blech, right? You might just be feeling blech. It's not like a panicky, hyper crisis anxious. It's like a low-grade anxiety that's never stopping. Like maybe you want to be able to see this too? This is Isaiah. He's joining us. Come on up. Isaiah's going to join us. Like maybe you are in the position where you're feeling like, okay, I was working, I had projects, I had things that were going on, and then all of a sudden they've just stalled out. It's just like, ugh. Or maybe you're like me and you're like, I've got a job now. I have no sense that I'm about to lose my job, but I've got this kind of low-grade anxiety that might happen and that I have no control over that. Or maybe you're just been in your PJs for like 6 days and you just feel miserable from that. Or even just kind of the heaviness of recognizing that under at least some iterations, a lot of people are going to get this disease. And maybe you're like walking around like I am and you're at the grocery store and you're wondering like, is anything that I'm doing making a difference? And so if that's where you are, if that kind of like malaise or like sort of low-grade existential crisis, just the blech is where you are, then I think that the book for us is Ecclesiastes. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight, is about how I think Ecclesiastes gives us tools for thinking through that kind of blech that you might be experiencing during this COVID-19 pandemic. So what do you need to know as we start looking at Ecclesiastes? Well, the first thing you need to know is the book of Ecclesiastes is primarily, most of the words in Ecclesiastes are from this one guy named the preacher who's in the midst of an existential crisis. He's not raging at God like Job. He's like got the does it even matter, jaded, frustrated view of a cynic. And most of the book of Ecclesiastes is his wrestling with, does it even matter? What difference does it make? How can I live my life in the midst of all the things that are going on? And that's what most of the words in Ecclesiastes come from him. There's also another voice in Ecclesiastes, which is the voice of the guy who wrote the book down. And so there's another voice in Ecclesiastes who introduces us to the preacher in the first verse, and at the end kind of explains how we should interpret the preacher's words at the end. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you now so you can see. Let's see if this works. Let me know. Can you guys see my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So what is the preacher's problem in Ecclesiastes? Like right out of the gate, and again, it's this kind of like feeling like blah. The preacher tells us that everything is, the NIV says meaningless. The ESV says vanity. The New English translation says futile. Everything is blah. Now, the reason why the different versions have such trouble translating this word is because the word there actually means mist or vapor. And the preacher explains what he means by this in verse 14. Everything is a mist and a striving after the wind. And if you think about striving after the wind, the thing about a mist or a wind is not that it's meaningless or pointless or non-existent. It's that you can't control it. You can't get your hands around it. You can't manage it. And that's the preacher's primary problem. He looks at life and says, there's all this stuff going on, and I can't take control. I can't own it. I can't manage it. And that makes me feel like there's no point at all. What are some of the things that make the preacher feel this way? Well, why would he say that? Well, one thing is he looks at it and he says, the world is really broken, and there's not always much we can do about it. So Ecclesiastes 1:15 says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. The preacher looks at the world and says, there are so many messed up things that can't be put right, and there's so much missing that we can't fix. He says in another passage in 4:1-2, that I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead, who are already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Now here is the preacher looking out and seeing oppression and injustice and brokenness and saying, there's nothing we can do about it. Right? And maybe that's how you're feeling during this COVID-19 thing. Every day we get up on the news, on the internet, we're reading about serious, long-term human suffering at an enormous scale. And the way that most of us are responding is by staying home in our pajamas. Right? And we're seeing all this human suffering and pain, and there's not much that we can do about it. That's very similar to what the preacher is saying, and why he's saying everything is like striving after the wind. Another thing the preacher sees is that our work often fails us. In chapter 4, verses 4-8, he says, I saw all the toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor, and that's a vanity and a striving after the wind. And again, I saw vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I laboring and toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. Over and over again, the preacher looks at his work and says, you can work all you want, it doesn't get you anywhere. And maybe you're feeling like that. Like, I know for me, I look at all the projects and activities at work that I was fully invested in that have just come to a grinding halt. I've talked to some of you who are prepping students for ACT tests that have been canceled, or coaching teams that will not play anymore, or trying to teach kids from a distance, and you're just thinking, what's the point of all this work that I've done that's just come to a grinding halt? That's what the preacher is saying. The preacher looks at and he says that our behavior often fails us. We try to be good, we try to be wise, And yet, as Ecclesiastes 2:14 says, the wise person and the fool, the same things happen to them. No matter how you were trying to live, you're still sequestered in your house. No matter how you're trying to behave, what wisdom you're trying to bring, no matter how many articles you're reading about the COVID-19 virus, many of us are walking around wondering, am I going to get it? Are my loved ones going to get it? Are the things that I'm doing making a difference? And we may feel like the preacher that our choices and our behaviors don't really make a difference. This is how the preacher says it in chapter 8. There's a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. And there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. And this also is vanity, or a mystery, or a mist. But most disorienting of all for the preacher, and the thing that makes me think that Ecclesiastes may be the right book for some of us during this virus, is that the biggest problem the preacher sees is that all of our lives are lived under the shadow of death. The heaviest reality for the preacher is that we are going to die. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts. For all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Ecclesiastes 3:19-21. Preacher looks out and he says, death casts this shadow on everything that we do. And for the preacher, in this crisis that he's in, that can make it hard to even get out of the bed, hard to even continue day to day. And maybe some of you are feeling like that. Maybe some of you are feeling like in the middle of this pandemic, where the numbers of people who are sick, the numbers of people who are dying are growing, and they're coming closer to home for so many of us, that you find yourself just kind of surrounded with this anxiousness and fear and pain over the reality of death. And maybe you find yourself wondering, like the preacher, does it even matter what I do, how I live? Where do I go in the midst of this pain and crisis that our world is experiencing, but that is also affecting us at a very deep level? That's the world that the preacher's living in. I think for many of us, it's the world that we're living in. What's the preacher's solution? Well, the crazy thing about Ecclesiastes is the preacher has the most bleak view of the world of anybody in the Bible. He takes the harshest view of the world and what it's like. And his counsel in the midst of that, over and over again, in the midst of his crisis, what he comes up with, how do we live in a world where our work we can't depend on, our behavior we can't depend on, a world in which we can't fix the things we want to fix, and a world in which we're living in the fear of death? How do we survive all of that? And the preacher's solution is very bizarre. He says, find joy in the midst of it. Find joy in the midst of it. And he says specifically to find joy in three places. First, the preacher says to find joy in the small created things. Over and over again, the preacher says, there is nothing better for a person living in this world that's scary and difficult that he's described than that we should eat and drink and find enjoyment in our toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? Again, in Ecclesiastes 8:15, he says, and I commend joy, I recommend joy, for man has no good thing under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given them. So the preacher says, find joy in the small created glimpses of goodness that we experience throughout the day. Even in a world where our work seems to have run out, even in a world under the shadow of death, even in a world with brokenness we can't fix, find joy, the preacher says, in food and drink and the created goods that God gives us. Secondly, he says to find joy in strength in friends and family. In this famous passage from Ecclesiastes 4, he tells us two people are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who's alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who's alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Or again, in Ecclesiastes 9, 7 through 9, the preacher says, enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he's given you under the sun, because that's your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. So the preacher says, find joy in the created goods like food and drink and a beautiful day and a sunrise and a song, but also find joy in the people that you find yourself with. Friends, family, those nearest to you. Find joy with them and in them. And lastly, he says, find joy in whatever work you find yourself doing. Over and over again, the preacher tells us when you try to manage the world through your work, you end in frustration because it won't work. When you try to use your work to take control, that's vanity. That's a chasing after the wind. But then over and over again, he also tells us that one of the gifts that God has given us is to do whatever our hands find to do. In Ecclesiastes 9, whatever your hands find to do it with all your might. If there's no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, that is the place of the dead. It's where you're going. So the preacher says, work while you can with whatever you find at your hands to do. And again, in Ecclesiastes 11, he's specifically warning that we not let the fear and the danger we see around us keep us from the work that's in front of us. He says, if you observe the wind, you won't sow your seed. And if you pay too much attention to the clouds, you won't go out and reap. But you don't know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child. So you do not know the work of God who makes everything. So in the morning, sow your seed, and in the evening, do not withhold your hand. For you don't know what will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. And what the preacher is saying is, when work stops being something that we use to control and becomes just something that we go to with whatever's before our hands, we can be free to find the gifts of God and the joy that God gives in that work. So what does that mean for us in the middle of like a COVID-19 crisis? Well, I think what the preacher would tell us is that we need to find joy in the small places in the midst of the chaos and the uncertainty and the fear. To find joy in the food that's on our table. To find joy in the people who are at that table. Whether those are members of our family or a roommate or someone on the phone or even FaceTime. To find joy in the human interactions that God gives us. This one's really hard for me because I'm a hyper extrovert. And so there aren't that many people around. And I think the preacher's calling me to take joy and delight in those who are near me, including this child who's shoving his face into your computer screen right now. The preacher's saying, find joy in the simple things, in the weather, in food, in drink, in the people that you're close to, and with whatever work you find yourself to do. My guess is that there's nobody on this call whose work hasn't been erupted in some major way, who isn't feeling the stress of not going to work, and so you're stuck at home working with kids in a way that you're not normally doing, or going to work in fear because you have to keep working, or some other way that your work has been altered. And what I think the preacher's telling us to do is to find joy in whatever it is that God has given you in the task for today. Find joy there. That's the advice that the preacher gives us. But the preacher doesn't have the final word in Ecclesiastes. See, at the very end of the book, the author who has recorded the preacher's crisis for us sort of wraps it all up. And I find a lot of encouragement in that because we actually don't see the preacher get out of his crisis. The author tells us that he does, but we actually don't get to see it. For the preacher at the end of Ecclesiastes, he's still wrestling with these issues. And I think that's God's way of saying to us, if you're in the midst of these emotional turmoil, God is with you there. You don't have to put a bow on it. You don't have to feel good about it. You can be in the midst of the struggle with God in that crisis, and he's there with you. But then at the very end of the book, the author tells us how we're supposed to read this whole experience that the preacher's had. And this is what he tells us. He says, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's the end of the matter. This is the author of Ecclesiastes' way of saying, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and everything will follow after it. So even as we look for joy in the midst of our struggle, we also look to God in a relationship with him. We lean into our prayers. We lean into the scripture. We look for ways to grow in our relationship with God and to obey him in whatever he's put in front of us. So that's my prayer for us today, that for those of you who are feeling the blah, for those of you who are feeling the low-grade anxiety, the slow burn of an existential crisis, that you would find joy in the simple things, in the people around you, in whatever works at your hands. You would find ways to look to the Lord even in this time and expect him to show up. So let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this day. Thank you for the way that you love us, even in the midst of our turmoil. We thank you for the way that you are gracious to us, even in the midst of our fears and anxieties. God, we pray that you would give us the ability to find joy, even in the midst of such uncertain times. To find joy in the food that you provide to us, in the people that you put near us. God, to find joy in whatever the work of our hands looks like today, whether that's caring for a loved one, taking groceries to someone who doesn't have them, checking in on a friend or a family member. Whatever it looks like, Lord, help us to find joy in it, and help us to be people who, even in all the uncertainty and fear, look to you and live with you and for your glory and for our good. Lord Jesus, we pray these things in your name. Amen. Okay, so before we leave, I'm going to give you some discussion questions and some homework based on this Bible study. But what we want to do now is spend some time giving y'all an opportunity to ask some questions. So we've asked Pastor Richard and two physicians in our church body, Dr. Rob Bradsher and Dr. Brooke Laurent, to be available to dialogue with us about how we're feeling about this crisis and what questions we might have. And those questions can be medical, they can be spiritual, they can be anything that you want them to be. We just want to open it up to share with one another. So I think probably the best way to do this is for you to type your question, and I'll kind of moderate and direct those questions to Brooke and Richard and Rob. And so if you've got a question, you can go ahead and send those into the chat feature, and we'll do as much of that as we can with the time that we've got.
Mm-hmm. Can I be heard?
Isaiah, do you have a question?
Isaiah, do you have a question about COVID-19?
Not really.
Not really. He's got it covered.
Michael, I think it'd be good. I'd love to hear from Rob and Brooke just on how their faith has informed their work over the last however many days, I've lost count, and how they're applying that faith in the midst of this.
I think that's a great question. Rob, Brooke, do either of you guys want to take that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's been a real whirlwind. The cognitive mind stuff versus the heart and emotion stuff is tricky, because at one point it's kind of like, well, this is kind of unavoidable. You know, the disease happens and we'll do everything we can, but you know, we can't really prevent this from making people sick and having scary things happen. And then really thinking about the reality of that, like, you know, on one hand thinking, yeah, we all are frail and fragile, and you know, teach me to number my days so I may gain a heart of wisdom. Check. I've numbered my days. The coronavirus could take me or anybody. So that's the head part. And then there's the heart part of like, oh my gosh, this is really scary. This is totally unprecedented. No one's ever seen anything like this. What do we do? So that tension has been something just to kind of lean into and to be, to acknowledge for myself or for others, you know, trying to, the thing that really stuck out to me is the first time I took care of a patient that has this disease, you know, just seeing the nervousness, the anxiety, the fear. It was really a sobering moment of like, okay, instead of thinking about this or reading about this, like, I just want to take really good care of this person. I just want to be Jesus's hands to them. I want to, speak words of truth and peace and encouragement. And then, recognize that I'm not in control, we're not in control. And that is, I think, the best message that somebody can receive is like, we'll take really good care of you, and I can help point you to a higher power. So I hope that it's an opportunity for people's faith to grow through the whole process.
So I would say that my experience resonates with what Rob is saying. As of this point, I have not yet worked directly with patients at this time. Our healthcare system is staggering people because we are obviously concerned about our workforce right now. And I'll go into detail about what I am engaging with right now. But I would say the first thing is this is when faith and experience come like face to face. And so this is now exercising the muscles of faith on a lot of different levels. And immediately, I think maybe part of it is just being trained. You just go in like action mode. You got to get organized. You got to get people informed. You got to make sure everyone is safe. So you're just kind of going and going and going. And for me, I have been doing that probably for the past, because things started to amplify on this side of the state in Arkansas within the past 5 to 6, 7 days. And I've been going and going and going until I literally, I literally had to be intentional about stepping away from everything. And it's funny, like my prayers have just been much more simpler and much more, in my mind anyway, profound and simpler. Like it's less verbose and it's just simple. And, Psalms like Psalm 46 and Psalm 120, like, you are my fortress, my rock. I trust in you and we will not be moved, we will not be shaken, means very different to me right now. And so there is a sense of gratitude really that's coming out of that. And I'm grateful for that. It's interesting, and I'm going to go out a little bit on a ledge here, because you always hear about, is this from the enemy? Is this from God? And I felt like, yes, this is, of course, this is an attack from the enemy, but this is also an attack from God against the works of the enemy. Because there's a lot of things that has caused us to halt, and we have to get into this contemplative state to hear things. And that's a paradox that I am just praying through and accepting. But I do sense God's peace in this, and in a very real way right now. I do sense God guarding my heart. And this is just where I am today. Tomorrow it can be flipped up and it could be like, we're going into it, because I was just saying, I'm a medical educator. I am a family medicine doc, but I'm also doing work with communities who don't have access to the gloves and masks that you're seeing right now that is on shortage. And we're talking to mayors who don't really know how to coordinate with their county officers. And they're also in a state of hospitals closing to begin with, so their capacity is the lowest. So they're approaching us and our institute for guidance. And so there are these three components where these are very real things that are going on. There are communities who also don't believe this is real, by the way. And we're educating them. And unfortunately, churches, there's other churches in rural areas that don't believe this is real, and just educating and trying. We're just into these uncharted territories right now. So I would say again, and if I digress, I'm sorry, this is about how my faith is being, how my faith is being, tested in this time. I immediately am calling people for prayer, for help. I'm surrounded by prayerful people, thankfully. So that's where I am right now. And I'm just grateful. I'm just grateful for this moment. The gratitude is, I'm just grateful, really grateful for this moment and for this time.
Brooke, Rob, those are both really great answers. And Brooke, you said something, Richard, I want you to chime in here as well. We had one person ask a question about if someone says that this virus is from God, is there a biblical response to that? Brooke, you just mentioned both the idea that we do have an enemy, a spiritual enemy. There are demonic forces at work in the world, and we also know that God is control and is using this. Richard, I'd love to hear anything you'd add to that. For me this week, as I'm reflecting on Ecclesiastes, the perspective of the preacher is that we don't have to sort that out, that faithfulness looks the same, and that sometimes the quest to explain and understand is not actually wisdom, it can become folly. So the Bible speaks with a lot of different voices about these issues, but I think from the perspective of Ecclesiastes at least, we can sort of move forward looking for joy in obedience, giving honor and reverence to God without being able to answer all those questions. But Brooke, I love what you said, and Richard, I'd be interested if you have anything to add about this idea that is this virus from God, that sort of a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whenever we face a time like this, whether it's 9/11 or a virus like this or a world war, I think every generation and every age has been forced to ask this question. And even, I was standing in the line with my mask and gloves on at Aldi or Aldi, however you say it, 2 days ago. And, this old man said, Jesus said, the world would be like this before he came, and, you just got to be ready. And I really believe this is the end of the world. And I think every generation has had an opportunity to feel that. Now, if we look at this compared to some of the, medical plagues, the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, or World War I or II, or the Holocaust, you got to say, okay, maybe this isn't on that grand scale. But there's no doubt, there's never a moment when God is not reigning over whatever's happening. So, I think that's great comfort. There's also never a moment where he's not working through the devil's and evil's schemes to bring forth good. I think we give the devil too much credit. And so what we can know is that God's at work. And yes, he's going to accomplish his purposes through this. And, I walked away from my sermon Sunday hoping that, or feeling like, I hope people didn't infer that I was saying what we're experiencing is the fulfillment of Isaiah 2. And I really, anyway, because that's not what I was saying. What I was saying is that, when you're suffering, whether it's individually or corporately as a nation or the world, those things that Isaiah was saying or has said and prophesied is reality. Our frailty must come forth, and his power and trustworthiness must be known as we understand we're not in control. And So, yeah.
That's really helpful. We're getting great questions. Feel free to keep typing those away, either directly to me privately if you prefer, or to the whole group. Doctors, we got a couple technical questions. We got one question on what can we do as non-medical people, as individuals, to help bring an end to this pandemic from a medical perspective. And then also we have a set of similar questions, maybe you can answer both of these at the same time, about just how worried should we be? Are we in this part of the country, do you think we're headed towards what we're seeing in New York and in Italy? Do you have a sense of the timeline? And we know these are, obviously questions that all the experts are scratching their heads over, but we'd love your advice, doctors, on both how can we help, and also how would you help us look ahead and expect reasonably based on what you're seeing?
I can start, Rob. I'm sure you can fill in a lot of things. What I'm learning in some of the community work that we're doing right now, those of us who are probably on this call who are very plugged in to access information can quote off your head all the CDC recommendations, right? 6 feet isolation, avoid all gatherings of any type, et cetera. That information is not available to everyone. It's not accessible to everyone, whether they're in an area where there isn't internet access. But if you are connected with someone in rural areas, if you're connected with someone through Facebook, go through your networks and kind of pass this along. There is significant, I'll say specifically on the side of Arkansas, and I know that Memphis is more urbanized, but there is a lot of skepticism. People tend to look at this like a county illness, that they'll look at their county and say, hey, I am good, or we have less numbers. The rate limiting factor here is that we don't have great testing capacity. And what that means is if you were to open a room and it's dark and you don't have a light to shine the light to see what's in there, you actually don't know what is going on. And it wasn't until the past couple of days to weeks that there's been an increase in that. But even some of the testing sites like around here, there may be only 20 or 40 they can do in certain regions. So they are pretty tight with the criteria for testing at this time. So I think people are relying, my guess right now is that there probably is an underestimation. And because of this underestimation, because of the lacking of testing capacity, also the delay of testing results, okay, the restrictions have to be really broad. Usually this information help epidemiologists, testing and results, et cetera, kind of put a better picture and kind of determine where it's going, what we need to do, and kind of can bring more restrictions to like the isolation and how long we need to continue to do this. So until we're able to get that cranked out for a lot of regions, and I know that there are rural areas right now who don't have this capacity, what happens to our most vulnerable populations do affect us a lot. They're the ones in which will need the hospitals and use up significant resources. And so what we do as a community by staying put really helps. There are great graphics about what that looks like that I can share with people, that you can share with other people. I'll be able to send that to you guys and you can share it to everyone. But staying put really does help. Church, unfortunately, as I said before, church gatherings in some of these areas are still happening. In mid-central Arkansas, 38 members contracted the virus, including the pastor and the pastor's wife. And so, we're just trying to get the message out right now. And so if people are not, and again, one of the upticks is that spring break happened or is happening. So people are going to be coming back from different locations. And this is why they're thinking there's going to be an uptick, where probably some young people are not taking this as seriously. And because there's kind of this not fallacy, but you can misread this information where it says 80% usually have mild to moderate. Moderate is also pneumonia. That is not a small disease, okay? Even if we treat it at home or at the hospital, pneumonia is serious. The severity complexity part that you keep hearing are the people who are so bad because of underlying conditions, heart, lung illnesses, or diabetes, they may need a ventilator. and ventilators are not abundant supply, as well as the protective equipment for the workforce. So this is what we're dealing with. There are a lot of moving parts. There are people who don't know. I think what we can do is think about your network and go beyond your network. Think about that distant cousin. Send the message out to them that is not in urban areas and rural areas, across the borders. People cannot look at this as a county thing. And one thing that's interesting is when you look at the border of the Mississippi County, those counties are lit up. On the opposite side, Arkansas is not lit up. And there's a false sense of security. So this virus knows no boundaries in these counties. My assumption is if that's lit up, the other side is too. People drive across and get across. And so that's what we're facing right now. And what you're doing is just getting the word out to whoever you can to stay put. And then we talk a lot about what we can't do. Let's talk about what we can do. We can walk outside. We can breathe as long as you're not next to each other. You know, you're 6 feet apart. Avoid contact sports, basketball, soccer. You know, unfortunately, the kids are outside playing basketball. That is a contact sport. But walking, there's been some studies, and Rob, you can speak to this, about how long the droplets last on surfaces, on steel, on plastic, on copper, on certain metal surfaces. So they can be there a little bit longer than we anticipate. But we can go walk. I've seen an uptick of people walking in my neighborhood. That's the first time I've seen it this much. That's a positive unintended consequence. When I go to the store, all the vegetables are left behind, which is not good, but I get all the vegetables. All the soda's gone. So, you know, there are these, but on a positive side, there are people who are doing different things right now, connecting through internet like we are right now. Just imagine also when you tell a church, a local church, and I don't mean to make this purely monetary, but when you're depending on tithes to pay the mortgage for these small churches, I mean, their churches they can lose their buildings. And so asking a church to not get together, you have to have some empathy and saying, I know this is hard, but we got to work it out. But that's what they're dealing with, right? So these are the conversations we're having with people. And I'm also concerned about services toward vulnerable populations. There probably has not been guidance about food banks and pantries of how they want to serve those who are most vulnerable right now. And I know everyone wants to jump in and help. But if they're not practicing these social distancing while they're helping, and when you wear gloves everywhere, it only protects you. It does not protect other people, because people don't switch gloves in between activities. When you switch gloves in between activities, that's when you're protecting other people and yourself. But when you're using the same glove for everything, you're only protecting yourself. And so that doesn't mean that you're all good. So we have to work with communities to be innovative of, I know these services are going to happen for home insecurity and food security. You know, we have to talk to some of these organizations to say, what are some ways that we can be innovative to keep the guidelines, because those potentially could be hotspots. And then there are these federal guidelines that are coming up right now that are helping small businesses. I'm telling you right now, some of these mom and pop shops cannot navigate this. So if you know someone that is good at going through helping people apply for loans, and you have that skill set, or you know people with those skill set and they need people to navigate how to apply for loans. I mean, these are coming. I know someone that has an MBA and navigating these federal applications are like, what is going on? That would be a great skill set too. You know, telemedicine is another option too, that people can, they've changed a lot of restrictions for providers for telehealth and telemedicine when our workforce is getting to that capacity. So that's all I have for now.
Brooke, that's really helpful. Rob, anything you'd add to that? And then maybe more quickly, 2 easy questions to add on to your answer there, about any advice on what to do when we're at the grocery store, and can we send letters to people?
So working backwards, I think that sending stuff through the mail is okay. Brooke mentioned the fact that these viral fomites, or whatever you want to call them, these particles of the virus, last on certain substances for a couple of hours. So cardboard's kind of on the lower side, plastic and other things were a little bit higher, but I think the longest was in like the 10-hour, 12-hour range. But even still, if let's say you got a piece of mail, anytime you touch something, you should clean your hands afterward. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I mean, I go through Purell like it is something that you go through a lot of, because as soon as I touch a desk or anything else, I'm like, oh, I'm going to use Purell, especially if I'm not in my home. If I'm anywhere outside of my home, if I have touched something, I must use Purell before I touch any other part of my body. Or if I touch something and then I touch my shirt, then if a family member gives me a hug, then they could spread that. So you really have to think of your hands continuously as vectors. If you imagine a little green cloud around your hands, and like when you use Purell, there's no green cloud, and then anytime you touch anything else, there's a green cloud. And if I touch my computer, if I touch this lamp or whatever, it's spread. That's a helpful tool. So if I go to the grocery store, I would. The whole mask debate gets heated. People feel strongly about don't wear a mask, do wear a mask. It freaks people out and creates a lot of hype versus it's protective. I would err on the side of wearing a mask if you're ever going to be around somebody and closer than 6 feet, because of the reality of asymptomatic spread. So I went to the grocery store last night and I didn't take a mask with me, but I was constantly scanning, like I'm not going to be right next to somebody. I'm not going to, when the lady tries to offer me the receipt, I just say, no, thank you. I don't want anybody to hand me anything because I don't know if their green cloud is going to pass to me or whatever. And it's not because I'm so worried about myself, but that whole thing is what just causes the surge, the easy spread of this virus. And so this virus is tricky compared to others because of a couple of technical things that y'all, I wouldn't be surprised if you've already read all about this, but the whole incubation period thing, like when somebody gets the virus, it takes a little while for them to show symptoms. Most viruses, when you get sick and you're contagious, you have symptoms. So everybody knows it. You can see that person coughing up a bunch of phlegm or, looking all ill. You can see it or hear it or smell it. But in this situation, you can't, but they can still pass it to you and you can still pass it to others. So that's why the social distancing stuff is so important, is because even people who don't have any symptoms could be spreading this to one another, could be then spreading it to a very vulnerable person. And if that's happening on a exponential scale, that's when we overwhelm the healthcare system. Like Brooke mentioned, the vast majority of people have a mild to moderate case. That just means they don't die. It doesn't mean it's not terrible. It doesn't mean it's not really uncomfortable. So you don't want to have a mild to moderate case, but if you do, you'll be okay. It'll just be an uncomfortable thing. But passing to anyone who gets a severe case, who ends up on the ventilator, who has a life-altering illness or passes away from this, is the type of thing that we want to try and prevent. And so somebody asked if there's, what can we do medically? There's really not a ton to do medically. The hydroxychloroquine stuff and the azithromycin is not really founded. I wouldn't put any stock in particular pills or fish food. Somebody died from eating fish. I thought it would, if they ate hydroxychloroquine, that it would protect them from coronavirus and it killed them. Don't do that. But there are no specific medications you should use. But the best medical treatment is social distancing, and it is staying away and preventing spread. So that should just be the lens through which we see how to go about day to day. And it's actually super duper encouraging that that our country, that our communities have been so aggressive in ensuring that social distancing occurs. It won't cause the virus to burn out. This is going to be something that lingers for a while, and it's hard to say how long we will all be living life this way instead of the way that we used to. But the reasons for that are really, really good and protective of the community at large. So somebody asked about what's the timeline about when things could return to normal, or what are the factors that the medical community will assess to recommend return to normal. I think it'll be epidemiologic stuff. So, every day across the country, they're watching the numbers. They're saying how many confirmed cases are out there. And we're starting to see that spike up pretty significantly because of what Brooke said about testing. We're able to test. Ideally, we would test very aggressively, like test everyone. We don't have the resources to do that. We don't have the kits to do that. But that's how you can know what's really happening, shine the light in the dark room. And until we have good data and we see that curve start to peak and come down, until that happens, I think leaders will continue to encourage the social distancing, because we don't want to have our community turn into something that looks like Italy or other places. It could either way. That's a possibility. You know, even with all this, that type of thing could happen. But we're doing all the right things to prevent that to the best of our ability as a group.
Thanks, Rob. So we've got a couple technical questions. I think we want to wrap this up in the interest of time. So I want to address two of the more spiritual questions that have been asked, and then maybe leave room if people want to stick around after 8, or if Rob or Brooke, either of you are willing to chat in some quick responses, we can do that. But I want to honor people's time. Two more questions targeted towards spiritual health or emotional health. One was just about the question of, someone saying, I feel guilty and frustrated that I don't feel my anxiety disappearing because of my relationship with Jesus. And and then another question was about people who are struggling with depression and what advice would be given. Richard, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to both those questions. But my thought on the first one, about how to deal with the fact that we don't see our anxiety just disappearing because of our relationship with Jesus. I think the Bible is one long testimony to the fact that oftentimes God's people don't feel their anxiety disappearing. When you read through the Psalms, it's one long record of anxious people talking about their anxiety to God. That's the same thing with Job. That's the same thing with the preacher in Ecclesiastes. Paul talks like that. Jesus talks like that. So first thing I think I want to say really loud and clear is let yourself off the hook. Okay, if you don't feel just the peace that passes understanding every minute of the day, you're in good company, the company of David and Moses and Jesus and Paul and everybody else. But Scripture gives us tools for working out those anxieties with God, praying the Psalms, reading Paul's letters to anxious people in places like Philippians, leaning into the gospel stories about Jesus. So I think the worst thing you could do is get hung up over the fact that as human people, we feel those anxieties. And the best thing you could do is bring those to Jesus in his word, and use his word not just as sometimes when we feel anxious or scared, people use God's word as a weapon against us, like sort of do not fear, but instead of doing that, I would encourage you to use God's word as giving you words with which to process those anxieties with God. So that's what I would say about that, Richard. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as well as the question about depression. Then I'm going to wrap up our time. And as I say, if anyone wants to stick around, we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, Michael. I think we have to look at our spiritual lives as, kind of like this virus. I mean, God did not guarantee nor promise that we would be exempt from trouble. In this world, you will have many troubles. You will have many tribulations, and that's not just physical, it's emotional. That addresses depression, it's spiritual, and the only that there is coming a day when we will be void and we will be healed, the new heaven and the new earth, and that is our hope, and that's what we press toward. And until then, it is a struggle. Paul, his thorn in the flesh, I begged God 3 times, and God said, no, my power is made perfect in your weakness. So even though you're not healed from your anxiety or your depression, doesn't mean that God is not present, and it doesn't mean that God's not even using it for his glory and for your good. And so, I was thinking about this whole bailout, the $2 trillion bailout. How in the world we as a country can possibly afford $2 trillion, overnight. But that's who we are as a country. I mean, that's who we are as a people. There has to be a solution now. There has to be, we can't suffer. And I think the Christian life is suffering. Most of the people that, were around Jesus in his day lived in much harsher realities, physical, emotional realities than we do. And yet Jesus is enough. He's not enough to heal us right in the moment, but always. But he is enough because his hold on us is pushing us forward. And so, anyway, I think that there has to be real faith in the midst of this, that God is at work. And he's at work even when our depression doesn't subside. He's at work even when our anxiety is not subsiding. And one quick thing before we kind of wrap up, I do want to say, because we did get a lot of comments about our worship service, the way we're doing our worship service this Sunday is going to be radically different. So we will actually be in separate places. Adriana is going to be using an app to bring in singers and band members. And so we are going to be in isolation. We are going to be in accord with the shelter at home or safer at home guidelines, and are glad to do that. And so, anyway.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So as we wrap up, and I know there are a few unanswered questions, and I will just pass those on electronically to the people who I think are best equipped to answer them. For those who've asked questions that have gone unanswered. But as we close, I want to give you some homework, and I know you got time to do it. So, and the first bit of homework is, I really want to encourage you to talk to somebody either in your house or pick up the phone and call somebody. 2 questions. I'm putting these in the chat right now. And the first one is just going back to our discussion of Ecclesiastes. Where have you received joy in the middle of this pandemic? Whether in daily simple things, friendships and family, or the work that God's put in front of you. Where are you glimpsing joy that is a gift from God in the midst of the pandemic? And where do you find yourself striving after the wind? Tempted to try to manage or control or take over? Because I think the wisdom the preacher gives us is to look with gratitude towards those things that we're experiencing in joy, and to give up the attempt to manage and control. So talk about those 2 questions, which, as I say, I've put in the chat feature there for you, with somebody either in your home or on the phone. And the other thing I want to encourage you to do is this week to read Ecclesiastes. Over and over again, this really dark, kind of depressing book has proved very life-giving and encouraging to people who are struggling. So if you're looking for something to read, you got some extra time, work your way through this week. And remember that it's the testimony of someone who was experiencing some of the similar anxieties and fears and frustrations that we're talking about. I've also pasted in a link to the Bible Project's 5-minute video on Ecclesiastes, which is outstanding. So I encourage you to watch that with your kids or your friends or family this week as well. So we will gather like this next Wednesday, probably at the same time, right, Michael? Just nod your head. Okay. And we'll be sending out information about that. As I said, I'll send those who posted questions, I'll send them to the appropriate person who will hopefully get back to you. If you've got thoughts about what we could do during this time that would be super helpful, you can email those to Michael Davis or myself. And if you need help, if you are struggling, if you are finding yourself very isolated, please reach out to one of our staff or pastoral team and let us know how we can support. I get the sense that this is very hard for many of us. And if you need help, please reach out. Love you guys. Really grateful to Michael Davis for organizing this, and for we can give a silent round of applause to Richard and Brooke and Rob for being our experts. And we're going to record this. This has been recorded, so if you want to share it, we'll upload that on all the normal places. Love you guys, and talk to you later.
22 people were. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Dad, why do you keep moving all the people around?